July 13th, 1976. The day started like any other day at Graceland. The Memphis Mafia, Elvis's loyal crew of friends, bodyguards, and yes-men gathered in the living room, waiting for Elvis to wake up. They had been with him for years, some for decades. Red West had known Elvis since high school. Sonny West was Red's cousin. Dave Hebler had been Elvis's karate instructor and bodyguard. These weren't just employees. They were family, or so they thought. The morning was unusually quiet. Normally, there would be laughter, jokes, stories from the night before. But that morning, something felt off. Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, had been making phone calls all morning. Private calls behind closed doors. The guys noticed but didn't think much of it. Vernon handled business. That was his job? What they didn't know was that Vernon was calling Elvis's lawyer, preparing the termination papers, getting ready to end careers that had spanned decades. Red West sat in the kitchen, drinking coffee, talking to Sonny about plans for the upcoming tour. They were scheduled to go on the road in a few weeks. Vegas. Then maybe some dates in the South. Red was looking forward to it. He loved being on the road with Elvis. It made him feel useful, important, part of something bigger than himself. Sonny was talking about maybe taking his family on vacation after the tour. Maybe Hawaii. He'd saved up enough money. Life was good. Or so he thought. Within 2 hours, both men would be unemployed. Their lives shattered. Their friendship with Elvis destroyed. Because on this day, everything would change. On this day, Elvis Presley would do something unthinkable. He would fire them all. Not because they did anything wrong, not because they deserved it, but because Elvis's paranoia, his addiction, and his desperate need for control had reached a breaking point. This is the story of the day Elvis destroyed his inner circle, and the question that haunted him until his death. Did he fire his enemies? Or did he fire the only real friends he had left? By 1976, Elvis Presley was falling apart. His weight had ballooned. His performances were erratic. His prescription drug addiction was spiraling out of control. And his mind, once sharp, once creative, once capable of charm and wit, was clouded by pills, paranoia, and a deep, corrosive suspicion of everyone around him. He trusted no one. Not his manager, Colonel Parker. Not his girlfriend, Linda Thompson. Not even the Memphis Mafia. The group of men who had devoted their lives to protecting him, entertaining him, and keeping him company through the loneliest years of fame. The Memphis Mafia had been with Elvis since the late 1950s. They traveled with him, lived with him, partied with him. They were there when Elvis was drafted into the Army. They were there when his mother died. They were there through the Hollywood years, the comeback special, the Vegas residencies. They knew Elvis better than anyone. They had seen him at his best and at his worst, and they had stayed. Not because the money was good, though it was, but because they loved him. Or at least, they thought they did, and Elvis thought he loved them. But by 1976, love and loyalty had become tangled with dependence, resentment, and fear. The trouble started in early 1976. Red West, Sonny West, and Dave Hebler had been increasingly concerned about Elvis's drug use. They saw what was happening. They saw Elvis taking handfuls of pills every day. They saw him slurring his words on stage. They saw him nodding off mid-conversation. And they tried to help. They talked to Elvis. They talked to his doctors. They even talked to Colonel Parker. But nobody listened. Or worse, they listened and did nothing. Because as long as Elvis could still perform, as long as the money kept flowing, nobody wanted to rock the boat. But Red, Sonny, and Dave couldn't stay silent. They were watching their friend kill himself. So they did what they thought was right. They started limiting Elvis's access to pills. They talked back to the doctors who prescribed them. They confronted Elvis directly about his addiction, and Elvis hated them for it. Because in Elvis's mind, he didn't have a problem. He was taking medicine. Medicine prescribed by doctors. He wasn't a drug addict. Drug addicts were criminals, losers, weak people. Elvis was none of those things. He was Elvis Presley, the king, and the king didn't have a drug problem. So when Red, Sonny, and Dave tried to help, Elvis didn't see it as concern. He saw it as betrayal. He saw it as an attempt to control him, to undermine his authority, to treat him like a child. And the more they pushed, the more paranoid Elvis became. Were they trying to help him? Or were they trying to take over? Were they his friends? Or were they his enemies? But what happened next would shock everyone involved. In June 1976, Elvis made a decision. He was going to fire Red West, Sonny West, and Dave Hebler. Not himself, of course. Elvis couldn't face them. He couldn't look them in the eye and tell them they were done. So he had his father, Vernon Presley, do it. On July 13, 1976, at approximately 11:30 a.m., Vernon called the three men into his office at Graceland and delivered the news. The office was small, cramped. Vernon sat behind a desk piled with papers. The three men stood in front of him, confused about why they'd been summoned. Vernon wouldn't make eye contact. He looked down at a piece of paper, a script, essentially, that someone had written for him. And, in a flat, emotionless voice, he said, "Elvis has decided that he no longer requires your services. Your employment is terminated effective immediately." The room went silent. Red thought he'd misheard. "What?" Vernon repeated himself, still not looking up. "You're fired. Elvis wants you off the property by the end of the day." Sonny felt his blood pressure spike. "What are you talking about? We haven't done anything wrong." Vernon finally looked up, and the men could see he was uncomfortable, maybe even ashamed, but he continued, "This is Elvis's decision, not mine. I'm just delivering the message." Dave asked the question they were all thinking. "Where is Elvis? Why isn't he telling us this himself?" Vernon hesitated. "Then, he doesn't want to see you. He asked me to handle it." And in that moment, the three men realized the depth of the betrayal. Not only were they being fired after years of loyalty, but Elvis didn't even have the courage or the decency to face them. No warning, no explanation, no thank you for decades of loyalty. Just, "You're done. Get out." Red West was devastated. He had known Elvis since 1954. They had met in high school, where Red had protected Elvis from bullies who mocked him for his flashy clothes and greasy hair. Red had been there when Elvis recorded his first song. He had been Elvis's bodyguard, his confidant, his brother in every way that mattered, except blood. And now, after 22 years, he was being fired by Elvis's father in a cold, impersonal meeting. Red asked Vernon, "Why? What did we do wrong?" Vernon looked uncomfortable. He didn't have an answer. Or if he did, he wasn't willing to share it. He just said, "It's Elvis's decision. I'm sorry." Red left Graceland that day feeling like his heart had been ripped out. Sonny West was angry. He didn't understand. He had been loyal. He had protected Elvis from fans, from threats, from himself. He had taken punches meant for Elvis. He had sacrificed his own life, his own family, to be available to Elvis 24 hours a day. And this was how it ended? With a dismissal from Vernon? Not even the decency of a conversation with Elvis himself? Sonny demanded to see Elvis. He wanted answers. But Elvis refused to come out of his room. He couldn't face them. Maybe he knew that if he saw their faces, if he saw the hurt and betrayal in their eyes, he wouldn't be able to go through with it. So he hid, like a coward. And Sonny left Graceland that day, swearing he would never forgive Elvis Presley. What they didn't know was that Elvis was watching them leave. He stood behind the curtain in his bedroom window on the second floor of Graceland. He saw Red walk to his car, shoulders slumped, defeated. He saw Sonny kick the gravel in the driveway, angry and shouting. He saw Dave just stand there, frozen, trying to process what had happened. And Elvis felt nothing. Or maybe he felt too much and had numbed himself with pills to avoid it. Later that night, when Linda Thompson asked him if he was okay, Elvis said, "I did what I had to do." Linda asked, "Do you regret it?" Elvis paused for a long time. Then he said, "Ask me in a year." But he never got that year. He died 13 months later. Dave Hebler was confused. He had only been with Elvis for a few years, but he thought they had a bond. Elvis had embraced karate as a way to feel powerful, to feel in control, and Dave had been his instructor, his sparring partner, his friend. They had spent hours together practicing moves, talking about philosophy, sharing ideas. And now, just like that, it was over. Dave asked Vernon if there was any way to fix this. Vernon shook his head. "It's done." Dave walked out of Graceland in a daze, trying to understand what had just happened and why. And this is where everything spiraled into disaster. The three men, hurt, angry, betrayed, decided to do something drastic. They decided to write a book, a tell-all book about Elvis Presley, about the drugs, about the paranoia, about the guns, about the late-night rages and the bizarre behavior, about everything the public didn't know. The decision to write the book wasn't immediate. For weeks after being fired, Red, Sonny, and Dave tried to move on with their lives. They looked for other jobs. They tried to process what had happened, but they couldn't let it go. The betrayal was too deep, and they had bills to pay, families to support. They had spent their adult lives working for Elvis, and now they had nothing. No savings, no prospects, just bitterness and unpaid rent. Then a writer named Steve Dunleavy approached them. He was an Australian tabloid journalist who saw an opportunity. He said, "You guys have a story people want to hear, and I can help you tell it." At first, they hesitated. Writing a book felt like the ultimate betrayal. But then they thought, Elvis betrayed us first. He threw us away like trash. Why should we protect him? And so they agreed. They spent months recounting stories. The pills, the guns, the paranoid rants, the violent outbursts, everything. The book was called Elvis, What Happened, and it was published in August 1977, just 2 weeks before Elvis died. The book was brutal. It exposed Elvis's addiction, his violent outbursts, his obsession with guns and badges, his increasingly erratic behavior. And it sold because people wanted to know the truth about Elvis. But the truth destroyed him. Wait a minute, don't miss this detail. When Elvis found out about the book, he was devastated. Not angry, not furious. Devastated. Because he realized what he had done. He had fired the people who knew him best, the people who had tried to save him, and in response to being fired, they had exposed him to the world. The first copy of Elvis, What Happened, arrived at Graceland in early August 1977. Someone, Elvis never found out who, left it on his nightstand. Elvis woke up from a pill-induced nap around 3 p.m. and saw the book. He picked it up, read the cover, saw the names, Red West, Sonny West, Dave Hebler. His hands started shaking. He opened it and started reading. Within minutes, he was in tears. Not because the book was full of lies, but because it was full of truth. Things he had done, things he had said, things he wished nobody knew. He called Larry Geller, his spiritual advisor and hairstylist, and sobbed into the phone. "They destroyed me, Larry. How could they?" After everything, Larry tried to comfort him, tried to explain that maybe the book came from a place of concern, not malice. But Elvis wouldn't hear it. He said, "They wanted revenge, and they got it." He threw the book across the room. But later that night, he picked it up again and kept reading. But here's the thing. Red, Sonny, and Dave didn't write the book out of pure spite. They wrote it because they thought it might help. They thought that if the world knew what was happening, if fans knew the truth, maybe, just maybe, someone would intervene. Maybe Elvis would be forced to get help. Maybe the publicity would be the wake-up call he needed. But it didn't work. It only made things worse. Elvis read the book, or at least parts of it, and it broke him. He called friends and sobbed. He said, "How could they do this to me, after everything I did for them?" But the truth was more complicated. Yes, Elvis had been generous, He had given them cars, houses, money. He had taken care of their families. But he had also controlled them. He had demanded their loyalty 24 hours a day. He had isolated them from their own lives. And when they tried to help him, when they tried to save him from himself, he had turned on them. So who was the villain in this story? Was it Elvis for firing the people who cared about him? Or was it Red, Sonny, and Dave for exposing his darkest secrets to the world? Jerry Schilling, one of the few members of the Memphis Mafia who wasn't fired, later said that July 13, 1976, was the day Elvis lost his last real friends. Because after that, everyone who stayed did so out of fear. Fear of being fired. Fear of losing access to the money and the lifestyle. Fear of Elvis's anger. Nobody challenged him anymore. Nobody told him no. And that's when the addiction truly took over. Because Elvis surrounded himself with yes men and enablers. People who would give him whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted it. And what Elvis wanted was pills. Lots of pills. You won't believe this, but the firing of the Memphis Mafia wasn't just about paranoia. It was about control. Elvis's entire life had been controlled by other people. By Colonel Parker. By the studios. By the expectations of fans. The only thing Elvis felt he could control was his inner circle. And when members of that inner circle started acting independently, when they started questioning his decisions, confronting his doctors, trying to limit his drug use, Elvis panicked. He felt like he was losing control. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He eliminated the threat. He fired them. But in doing so, he eliminated the last people who genuinely cared about whether he lived or died. Joe Esposito, Elvis's road manager, stayed on after the firings. He later said in interviews that the atmosphere at Graceland changed immediately. It became quiet, tense. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody joked around. Everyone was afraid. Afraid of saying the wrong thing. Afraid of being the next one fired. And Elvis? Elvis was more isolated than ever. He had gotten what he thought he wanted. Complete control, complete obedience, but it made him miserable. Because control without connection is just loneliness with power. Priscilla Presley, Elvis's ex-wife, heard about the firings and called Elvis. She asked him why he did it. Elvis said, "They were trying to control me, Scylla. I had to take my power back." Priscilla said, "Elvis, they were trying to help you." And Elvis went silent, because deep down, he knew she was right. But admitting it would mean admitting he had a problem. And Elvis couldn't do that. So he doubled down. He insisted the firings were justified. He convinced himself that Red, Sonny, and Dave were traitors, that they had betrayed him, that he was the victim. And the more he told himself this lie, the more he believed it. But you haven't seen the biggest surprise yet. In the months after the firings, Elvis tried to reach out to Red West. Not directly. Elvis couldn't bring himself to make the call, but through intermediaries. He sent messages. "Tell Red, I'm sorry. Tell him I miss him." But Red didn't respond. He was too hurt, too angry. And by the time Red was ready to forgive, it was too late. Elvis was dead. Red West would spend the rest of his life wondering if things could have been different, if he had answered Elvis's calls, if he had tried harder to reconcile, if he could have saved his friend. But the truth is, nobody could have saved Elvis, because Elvis didn't want to be saved. He wanted to be in control, and you can't be in control and vulnerable at the same time. The day Elvis died, August 16, 1977, Red West, Sonny West, and Dave Hebler were devastated. Not because they were still angry, but because they realized that the book they wrote to help him had, in some ways, contributed to his downfall. The stress of the book's publication, the public humiliation, the betrayal, it all added to the weight Elvis was carrying, and that weight was too much. The three men attended Elvis's funeral. They stood in the back, not sure if they were welcome, and they cried, not just for Elvis, but for what could have been, for the friendship that was destroyed, for the paranoia and fear that poisoned everything. Linda Thompson, who was Elvis's girlfriend during the firings, later said that July 13, 1976, was the beginning of the end. She said, "When Elvis fired Red, Sonny, and Dave, he fired the last people who would tell him the truth. After that, it was just enablers, just people who would give him what he wanted to keep their jobs. And what Elvis wanted was killing him." Linda tried to stay. She tried to be the voice of reason. But by late 1976, she couldn't take it anymore. She left, and Elvis was alone, surrounded by people, but completely alone. What you're seeing now is nothing compared to this, because the story of the firings reveals the central tragedy of Elvis's life. He was a man who desperately wanted connection, but was terrified of vulnerability. He wanted people around him, but only on his terms. He wanted loyalty, but he couldn't trust. He wanted love, but he couldn't accept it without suspicion. And in the end, his need for control destroyed the very relationships that could have saved him. Charlie Hodge, one of the few who stayed with Elvis until the end, said that after the firings, Elvis would sometimes talk about Red and Sonny late at night. He'd say, "Do you think they hate me, Charlie?" And Charlie would say, "No, Elvis. They're hurt, but they don't hate you." And Elvis would nod, but Charlie could see he didn't believe it. Because Elvis had convinced himself that everyone was against him, that everyone wanted something from him, that nobody really cared. And the sad truth is, by the time he died, he had made that belief a reality. He had pushed away the people who cared, and surrounded himself with people who didn't. The firings also had financial consequences. Red, Sonny, and Dave sued Elvis after being fired. Not for a huge amount, just for severance and back pay. But the lawsuits added to the pressure. Colonel Parker was furious. He saw the firings as a liability, a PR nightmare. And he was right. The book, the lawsuits, the rumors, they all tarnished Elvis's image at a time when his career was already struggling. Ticket sales for his concerts were down. His performances were increasingly erratic. And the public was starting to wonder, what happened to Elvis? But the most heartbreaking part of the story came years later. In the 1980s and 1990s, the surviving members of the Memphis Mafia, those who were fired and those who stayed, started talking publicly about what happened. And they all said the same thing. Elvis was sick. He needed help. And instead of getting him help, the system around him enabled his addiction because it was profitable. Colonel Parker didn't want Elvis to get sober because a sober Elvis might fire him. The doctors didn't want to stop prescribing because they were making money. And the remaining entourage didn't want to challenge Elvis because they'd end up like Red, Sonny, and Dave, fired and broke. Jerry Schilling, who remained close to Elvis until the end, said, "The day Elvis fired Red, Sonny, and Dave, he didn't just fire his bodyguards. He fired his conscience. He fired the people who would call him out. And after that, there was nobody left to tell him the truth." Jerry also said that he thinks Elvis knew, on some level, that he had made a terrible mistake. But pride and addiction wouldn't let him admit it. So he lived the last year of his life in a prison of his own making, surrounded by people who feared him, isolated from the people who loved him, and drowning in pills. The book, Elvis, What Happened, is often blamed for Elvis's death. People say the stress of its publication contributed to his final decline. And there's some truth to that. Elvis was devastated by the book. He felt betrayed, exposed, humiliated. But the book also told the truth. Elvis was addicted. He was in danger. And someone needed to say it. Red, Sonny, and Dave thought that by exposing the truth, they could force intervention. But they underestimated Elvis's pride. And they underestimated the system around him that had too much to lose if Elvis got sober. In the end, the firings of July 13, 1976, were a symptom of a much larger problem. Elvis was a man who had been controlled and exploited his entire adult life. And the only way he knew how to assert his autonomy was through power and control. But power without wisdom is destruction, and control without trust is isolation. Elvis wanted to be in charge of his life, but he didn't know how to be in charge without pushing everyone away. And by the time he realized what he had done, it was too late. The people who could have saved him were gone, and the people who remained were the ones who helped him destroy himself. So the story of the day Elvis fired everyone is not just about paranoia or betrayal. It's about the impossible position fame puts people in. It's about the corrosive effects of addiction. It's about the tragedy of a man who wanted love but couldn't accept it, who wanted loyalty but couldn't trust it, who wanted control but couldn't handle the loneliness that came with it. And in the end, Elvis Presley died alone, not because he had no one around him, but because he had pushed away everyone who truly mattered. The last time Red West saw Elvis alive was at a concert in 1977, a few months before Elvis died. Red was in the audience, and for a moment, their eyes met. Elvis paused. Red thought maybe Elvis would acknowledge him, maybe wave, maybe smile. But Elvis looked away, and the concert continued. That moment haunted Red for the rest of his life. He was sitting about 10 rows back, stage left. Elvis was in the middle of Can't Help Falling in Love. The lights were bright. The crowd was loud. But for just a second, Elvis's eyes found Red's. And Red saw something in those eyes. Not anger, not hatred, but sadness. Deep, soul-crushing sadness. And maybe regret. Elvis's mouth opened slightly, as if he was about to say something or at least acknowledge Red's presence. But then someone in the front row screamed, and Elvis's attention shifted. The moment was gone. After the concert, Red sat in his car in the parking lot for an hour. He thought about going backstage, thought about trying to talk to Elvis, thought about saying, "I forgive you, let's fix this." But he didn't. Pride stopped him. Hurt stopped him. The memory of being fired by Vernon instead of facing Elvis man-to-man stopped him. So he drove home. Red said later that he would give anything to go back to that moment, to stand up, to wave, to let Elvis know that despite everything, he still cared. But he didn't. And Elvis died without ever knowing that Red had forgiven him. Tell us in the comments, have you ever faced a moment where you had to prove yourself or lose everything? What's the hardest comeback you've ever made? Do you think the pressure of fame is worth the glory? Let us know what city you're watching from today. Subscribe to our channel for more untold stories of Elvis Presley, the moments that tested him, and the performances that defined him. Hit the bell to never miss a story that matters.